On September 19, 1944, near the town of Aracourt in Lorraine, France, a dramatic and pivotal encounter unfolded between American Sherman tanks and German Panthers, set amid dense morning fog that shrouded the battlefield. The American tank crews of the 37th Tank Battalion were tense as they operated their Shermans, aware that the powerful and seemingly invulnerable Panthers posed a grave threat. Yet tucked in their ammunition racks were 6 rounds of a new, high-velocity armor-piercing, HVAP, shell with tungsten carbide cores, designed to challenge German tank superiority, an unexpected secret weapon. The fog itself played a crucial role, obscuring German reconnaissance and air support while enabling American tanks to control defensive positions strategically. German Panthers, despite their technical advantages with thick, sloped armor and powerful guns, advanced blindly and in column formations, exposing their more vulnerable side armor. The Americans used this vulnerability and the fog's concealment to launch deadly flanking attacks, striking the Panthers' weak points with the new HVAP rounds that could penetrate armor previously thought impenetrable. This engagement unfolded within the larger Battle of Aracourt, lasting from September 18 to 29, where superior American combined arms tactics and clever use of terrain offset the Panthers' technological advantages. American forces, though outnumbered, successfully destroyed a significant portion of German tanks with comparatively minimal losses, marking one of the largest and most successful armored encounters for the U.S. in Europe. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. For American crews, the HVAP ammunition instilled new hope and fighting spirit, no longer facing an invincible foe. For German tankers, the myth of their armor's invulnerability was shattered, forcing more cautious and defensive tactics. This battle symbolized a turning point where innovation, training, and ingenuity began to outweigh sheer technical superiority on the armored battlefields of World War II, setting the stage for the broader Allied advance into Germany. September 1944 marked a critical phase in the Allied push across France, but the American advance was increasingly hampered by the arrival of German Panther tanks on the battlefield. These tanks were a formidable presence, combining thick, sloped armor that could deflect many Allied shells with powerful 75mm guns capable of devastating mid-range fire. American tank crews quickly realized that their standard Sherman tanks, armed with less effective ammunition, were at a severe disadvantage. This imbalance was not just a question of technology but also tactics. The Panthers were often deployed en masse, leveraging their defensive strengths and superior firepower. Their presence challenged the Allies' strategic expectations, as prior intelligence had underestimated the number and capability of Panther units. Many battles turned into deadly duels where Shermans had to contend with attacks from angles where their armor was weakest, leading to significant American losses and morale challenges. General Dwight D. Eisenhower and Allied commanders faced mounting pressure to adapt. Reports from the front revealed the heavy toll the Panthers were inflicting on American armored divisions, threatening to stall the liberation of France. There was an urgent need for a solution, both to enhance the firepower of American tanks and to revise plans for armored engagements. Meanwhile, the Germans relied heavily on the belief that their Panther tanks were near invincible. This confidence pervaded their tactics and morale. Yet, their Achilles heel remained. Their side armor was thinner and vulnerable to new types of ammunition under development. However, slow communication of this vulnerability among frontline troops, coupled with evolving battlefield conditions, meant the Panthers were still imposing an intimidating and deadly presence. The Panther tank's dominance in these battles highlighted the need for innovation in American armored warfare, both in technology and tactics. This period saw the beginnings of efforts to close the gap, including improved ammunition design and better training in tank maneuvering and combined arms operations that would eventually shift the tide of armored combat in the Allies' favor. In early 1944, as the United States faced the stark reality of the Panther tank's dominance on the battlefield, American ordnance engineers and metallurgists set out to revolutionize tank ammunition to restore parity in armored warfare. The result was the development of the M93 high-velocity armor-piercing, HVAP, round, a groundbreaking design that combined cutting-edge metallurgy and physics to overcome the Panther's formidable defenses. The M93 HVAP round featured a tungsten carbide core, an extremely hard and dense material, encased in a lightweight aluminum body with a ballistic windshield. This unique construction allowed the projectile to maintain a much higher velocity, over 1,000 meters per second, compared to the standard M62 round 792 meters per second. This increase in speed translated directly into significantly enhanced armor penetration, capable of piercing up to 160 millimeters of armor at 1,000 yards, far surpassing previous ammunition capabilities. However, this innovation was challenged by severe material shortages. Tungsten, crucial for the core, was a strategic resource primarily imported from China and limited within the United States. Competing demands from multiple war industries stretched supplies thin, making production of HVAP rounds slow and rationed. Despite these constraints, the Ordnance Department pushed forward, initiating limited production in mid-1944. The development and deployment of the M93 HVAP round marked a dramatic turning point. Suddenly, American Shermans wielded a weapon that could threaten the so-called invincible Panther frontally, particularly targeting vulnerable points like the gun mantlet. This development forced German crews to reassess their confidence in their tanks' armor superiority and shifted the tactical calculus of armored engagements. While the technology proved potent, its scarcity meant that tank crews had to use these rounds judiciously. Training lagged behind production, leaving many crews to learn the round's true potential and limitations through harsh combat trials. Nevertheless, the presence of the HVAP round in their arsenal gave American tankers renewed hope amid the gritty battles unfolding across France and beyond. The arrival of the M93 HVAP rounds on the European battlefields marked a turning point but came with significant challenges tied to their scarcity and distribution. Although the American Ordnance Departments had developed this revolutionary ammunition by mid-1944, actual production and deployment were hampered by severe material shortages, especially tungsten, a critical component limited by global supply constraints. Initial shipments of HVAP rounds to the European theater of operations were painfully limited. The first batch of about 1,000 rounds arrived in August 1944, rushed by air to support frontline units during critical engagements. Following this, production steadily increased, but monthly outputs remained far below the ideal targets set by military planners. Even by early 1945, many Sherman tanks carried only a handful of these specialized rounds, on average about 5 per tank in combat zones. Because of this scarcity, allocation became a tactical and logistical puzzle. Tank destroyer units, like those equipped with M18 Hellcats, were given priority for HVAP ammunition given their designated anti-tank role. Conventional Sherman units, which often faced enemy armor more frequently, had to manage with smaller HVAP stocks amid their other infantry support duties. Training and tactical adaptation lagged behind the availability of this new ammunition, meaning many crews had limited understanding of when and how best to use their HVAP rounds. Nevertheless, the round's presence had an outsized psychological effect, boosting tanker confidence that penetrating the invincible Panther armor was now possible under the right conditions. This combination of advanced metallurgy, constrained production, and cautious but impactful frontline use represented the complex reality of wartime innovation. The HVAP ammunition did not magically erase the Panther's advantages but shifted the balance sufficiently to allow American tank crews to fight with new hope and tactical options even when outnumbered or outgunned. The morning of September 19, 1944 broke over Lorraine as a wall of white, a fog so dense that even veteran crews of the 37th Tank Battalion could barely see the hedgerows that hemmed the approaches to Aracourt, and yet within that blindness lay a rare American advantage against the Panthers rumbling forward to smash the bridgehead on Patton's flank. Each Sherman crew had been briefed in hushed tones about the 6 new high-velocity armor-piercing rounds tucked into their racks: use them wisely, aim for the mantlet, and fight for angles, because this tungsten-core ammunition could turn a desperate standoff into a swift, decisive kill if the shot landed true at the right range. Across the mist, German tankers of the newly assembled Panzer brigades advanced with the confidence of steel and slope, trusting the Panther's glassy and long L/70 gun to dominate the field once the sun burned through, unaware that the fog and a handful of specialized rounds were about to upend their assumptions about American firepower. The German plan looked overwhelming on paper, 5th Panzer Army hurled the 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades at the American salient, together mustering roughly 150 armored fighting vehicles against Combat Command A of the U.S. 4th Armored Division, which had perhaps 50 Shermans ready to fight, a numerical and technical edge the Germans expected to translate into a rapid victory. But haste, inexperience, and fog conspired against them. Reconnaissance was thin, infantry support was scant, and Panthers rolled in column into ground the Americans had spent days learning by touch and memory, a mismatch between German machine and German method that American crews were ready to exploit with calm, disciplined fire. Near the southern approaches to Aracourt, Captain Kenneth R. Lamison C Company of the 37th Tank Battalion waited in hull-down positions when the 1st Panther loomed out of the mist at scarcely 75 meters, its bulk suddenly too close for the long gun to matter and just close enough for a steady gunner to test the new round on the curved shield of the enemy's pride. The HVAP round struck the mantlet with a brutal, surgical certainty, its tungsten core punching through cast steel to touch off ammunition below the breech, and the Panther died with a heave of the turret that shocked the crews lurking behind it, who had been told the front of their tanks could not be pierced by American 76s. Two more Panthers appeared in succession and met the same fate before their gunners could settle on targets, the fog turning the Panthers' reach into a liability and the Sherman's shorter reaction time into a decisive, intimate advantage. That morning's pattern repeated across the sector, Panthers in column, side armor exposed by terrain bends and uncertainty, meeting Shermans and M18 Hellcats that waited to fire from defilade with pre-sighted lanes and a clear understanding that the mantlet, turret face, and angles mattered more than raw thickness at 1,000 meters they could not yet see. As the fog thinned toward noon, American forward observers stitched artillery onto German assembly points, while P-47 Thunderbolts from the 405th Fighter Group slashed through cloud breaks to rake stalled armor with rockets and machine guns, the orchestration of combined arms turning German technical superiority into isolated, burning silhouettes. What the Panther earned in metallurgy, the Americans erased with choreography, tank destroyer, infantry, artillery, and air woven into one responsive net, in which a misjudged German thrust was punished from multiple directions faster than the brigades could adjust. By the end of the sustained fighting around Aracourt, American forces had destroyed or disabled approximately 86 German tanks and assault guns while losing 25 Shermans and 7 tank destroyers, a ratio that startled even veterans who had learned to fear the first flash of a Panther's muzzle through hedgerow and haze. The numbers mattered, but the change in mood mattered more. American crews now believed they could hurt what they could see and outthink what they could not, while German crews realized that the story they'd been told, that the Panther front was a shield against all American guns, was no longer true at the ranges and angles that the battlefield kept forcing upon them. Reports clawed their way back up German lines that afternoon, confused, indignant, and afraid. Some officers insisted the Americans had snuck 90mm guns into the sector, others saw British Fireflies everywhere in the fog, but the truth was both simpler and more dispiriting. American 76mm guns firing specialized HVAP could now punch through the places Panthers needed for their guns to work. The revelation did not erase the Panther's strengths, but it punctured the aura of invulnerability, and in armored war, the first myth to die is often the one that told you where to point your hull without fear. American tank commanders rationed their HVAP grudgingly, 6 rounds per tank was typical, and drilled their crews to waste none of them, saving tungsten for mantlets and turret faces at decisive moments while using standard rounds, movement, and flanking routes to set up the killing blows their scarce ammunition could deliver. The round's velocity and penetrative bite gave Shermans a window of lethality out to battlefield ranges that previously demanded suicidal closes, and even crews who carried only a handful knew the existence of the round changed how they fought and how they chose to stay and trade instead of calling for air and backing away. What training manuals hadn't yet formalized, combat taught in hours, shot placement was king, range judgment meant the difference between a tungsten shatter and a kill, and the geometry of real terrain, drainage dips, orchard rows, and the arch of a village lane, could be engineered into firing angles that neutralized slope and turned no-go fronts into vulnerable seams. On the German side, the inexperience of many crews in the panzer brigades collided with a battlefield that rewarded patience, scouting, and combined arms, and while the Panther could dominate a clear field from a prepared hull-down, it could not maneuver its way out of invisibility, disrupted radio nets, and the shiver that ran through a formation when the first front plate myth died in a sheet of sparks. The absence of adequate infantry screens and artillery coordination left Panthers to nose into killing grounds where American gunners had already measured the distance from hedgetop to farmhouse eave, and every minute spent correcting a column or backing out of a blind curve put more steel into the sky above them. By late afternoon, the brigade's paper advantage had melted into a tally of crews now wary of showing their turrets, engines running hot in reverse, and commanders weighing whether to press the attack or live to try again when the weather and the maps would be kinder. Aracourt's opening blows did not prove that the Sherman had suddenly become the better machine, they proved that the Americans had become the better system, and that a few ounces of tungsten placed exactly where design must make room for a gun to move could pull the teeth from a weapon built around its front. In the days that followed, that system, fog when given, artillery when called, air when the clouds would part, and HVAP when the sight picture steadied, continued to turn German thrusts into wrecks, a turning of the tide measured not just in destroyed tanks but in crews whose hands no longer trembled at the rumor of a Panther on the road ahead. By the time the larger battle had run its course, American tankers had learned that the Panther could be beaten without a miracle and that the miracle they did possess came not from a single round but from timing, teamwork, and the courage to hold a firing lane when the shadow and the fog finally stepped into it. And German tankers, looking at the neat, unsettling holes and mantlets that were supposed to be their armor's boast, understood that the war of material and method had shifted again, that somewhere across an ocean an industry had taught a medium tank to strike above its weight, and that at Aracourt the cost of underestimating that lesson had come due. At Aracourt, the first thing to break wasn't steel but certainty, as crews on both sides discovered that what they believed about invulnerability and inevitability could be punctured by a single tungsten core arriving at just the right angle and speed. American tankers who had learned in Normandy to call for artillery or air rather than duel frontally now felt a visceral shift, with a few precious high-velocity rounds on hand and clear targets like the Panther's mantlet, standing and trading suddenly seemed possible, even prudent, if the shot picture was right. The fog, the terrain, and the choreography of combined arms amplified that change, but what transformed behavior inside steel boxes was the knowledge that the round existed, that it had worked, and that the myth of the unbreakable front could be turned into a plan rather than a prayer. Before HVAP, many Sherman crews internalized a hard lesson: against Panthers, survival meant angles, flanks, and patience, anything but head-on at fighting distances where the German gun ruled the field. After HVAP, the same crews began holding lanes longer, accepting risk to place one decisive shot where the enemy's armor had to be thin for its gun to move and its turret to live. Even units that carried only a handful of the new rounds benefited from a subtler alchemy, because belief translates into tactics, and tactics into outcomes. When crews trust that a plan can bite, they execute with the steadiness and timing that make the plan real. Reports from Lorraine show that confidence spread by rumor and wreck, as word of penetrations against Panther mantlets traveled faster than formal training could arrive, reshaping how platoons apportioned risks and how commanders weighed the cost of holding ground versus ceding it to wait for air or artillery. On the German side, the shock cut the other way, because Panther crews had been told a story that kept them aggressive: keep the nose to the enemy and you are safe, your glacis and slope will carry you through the first volley and buy you the killing shot. Aracourt supplied too many counterexamples in a single week for that story to survive. The first commanders to watch a 76mm strike punch through a mantlet and blow ready ammunition learned in an instant that the front could not be trusted unconditionally, and the instinct that followed was not a doctrine but a flinch: angle more, expose less, commit slower, habits that buy survival but bleed initiative. After-action notes recorded confusion up the chain as explanations multiplied. Perhaps the Americans had hidden 90mm guns among their Shermans or borrowed British Fireflies, because admitting that a medium tank had found a surgical round for a known seam felt more threatening than a misidentified weapon on a fog-bound field. German intelligence officers sifting through wrecks found entry holes smaller than expected and unexploded examples of subcaliber projectiles, confirming that the Americans had fielded tungsten-core ammunition, a fact with implications that stretched from firing positions to factory floors across a continent under air attack. The professional reaction mixed grudging respect with frustration, because Germany had pioneered similar concepts with PZGR, 40 yet could not mass-produce them by late 1944, hoarding dwindling tungsten supplies for machine tools while frontline tanks kept standard loads, a material reality that no bravery could reverse. When crews know that the other side can penetrate what they once believed unassailable, they turn from bold advances toward hull-down caution, slower movement, and greater reliance on prepared positions, the exact posture that cedes tempo to an opponent designed to synchronize armor, artillery, infantry, and air. American morale gained from more than metallurgy. The combined arms system rewarded patience and teamwork, and HVAP amplified those virtues by giving a clear, teachable focal point: hold fire until the mantlet fills the sight, conserve the tungsten, let artillery and infantry shape the approach, and spend the rare shot only when geometry is in your favor. Field directives and technical booklets were blunt that tungsten was critical and the new ammunition must be used sparingly, which turned scarcity into discipline. The special rounds were for the moments that decided lanes and crossroads, not for speculative gunnery across uncertain ranges and angles. Because delivery times from U.S. depots to the European theater often ran 10 weeks and early shipments were tiny, units internalized rationing as a tactical principle, with tank destroyers prioritized and Sherman platoons learning to build engagements around one or two decisive penetrations rather than a string of hopeful shots. The cognitive load inside a turret is already high: range, lead, angle, terrain, friendlies, and adding, save tungsten for the mantlet, might have been one rule too many if the evidence hadn't been so compelling, but Aracourt supplied the compelling wreckage where confidence used to be. As that evidence accumulated, American crews became more willing to meet Panthers frontally under specific, rehearsed conditions, while their German counterparts grew more circumspect, a divergence that hardened with every engagement in which the side that believed in timing and teamwork outperformed the side that believed in armor alone. Doctrine reflects experience, and within weeks unit SOPs were informally revised to engrave priorities: mantlet first with HVAP, turret face or cheeks when angle allowed, then flanks by maneuver, codifying a target hierarchy that made sense of limited rounds and maximized the chances that when tungsten flew, it finished the fight. None of this erased the rounds limits, and the crews learned those just as quickly. The tungsten-core could shatter at lower impact velocities or ricochet off severe slopes, so range estimation and shot discipline mattered as much as courage, because a wasted HVAP not only failed to kill but also invited a lethal reply from a gun that still outranged the Sherman in open country. Training lagged behind delivery, so many crews learned by trial under fire, a brutal teacher that nonetheless left units with a shared memory of what worked and what cost too much for too little, sharpening the collective judgment that turned scattered reports into battlefield wisdom. By late September, that wisdom read like a new catechism: shape the fight with artillery and infantry, force the angle with terrain, hold HVAP for the mantlet inside effective velocity, and trust that the system will multiply one hard-won penetration into local collapse. For German tankers, the loss of the invulnerability myth felt personal because armor confidence is more than a statistic. It is the steady breath that lets a gunner take an extra half-second to refine aim and a commander risk one more meter to crest for a shot. When that breath hitches, shots go early and crests are refused. First-hand accounts from German veterans after the war describe how even a rumor of new enemy ammunition could slow an advance and stiffen the choice for defense, and Aracourt provided more than rumor. It provided mantlets with neat holes where none were supposed to be, a signal that every crew could read at a glance. Caution preserved vehicles in the short term but hollowed out operational intent, because brigades built to exploit shock and speed cannot fulfill their design while pausing to protect a promise their armor can no longer keep. American crews, meanwhile, carried a different memory forward, that they had stood and fired and watched the feared machine burn, which is the kind of proof that survives fear's return in the next valley and steadies hands when the next column appears out of morning haze. Scarcity continued to govern behavior. 2 or 3 special rounds per tank was often the reality even into early 1945, but scarcity made success feel earned and repeatable, a procedural confidence as practical as a checklist and as contagious as a victory speech in a company street. Thus the psychological war at Aracourt was won not by boasting or terror but by a disciplined promise kept under pressure: if the crew can hold the lane, and the observer can fix the enemy, and the pilot can break through the cloud, then the gunner can spend tungsten once and end the argument where the Panther must be thin to fight at all. In the aftermath, analysts would tally ratios and draw arrows on maps, but the most enduring change rode back with the crews in their own words: "We can hurt them if we choose the moment, and they know it now, which means they will choose fewer moments and give us more to choose from." That is how a handful of specialized rounds, rationed and hoarded, became larger than their count, by changing the tempo choices of two armies and replacing one side's superstition with a plan while replacing the other's plan with a superstition that the next hit could come through the one place they once believed was safe. By the third day around Aracourt, the Americans had turned a bruising survival contest into a study in orchestration, folding tanks, infantry, artillery, air, and a handful of HVAP rounds into one elastic killweb that punished every German misstep more quickly than the Panthers could adjust their sights or their story about invulnerability. The fog that first shielded ambushes gave way to a tempo built on radios and rehearsed rolls, with forward observers stitching time-on-target missions across approach lanes while tank destroyers and Shermans held their fire until angles and ranges matched what tungsten and geometry could truly solve. The point was never to win a duel of specifications, but to turn the duel itself into a trap, letting a platoon's patience and a battalion's guns make the Panther's next 100 meters cost more than any advantage in glacis and gun tube could afford. When the sun pried at the mist, P-47s of the 405th Fighter Group bored through the gaps to rake columns and assembly points, not to erase every tank from the field, but to break rhythm so thoroughly that artillery could finish the work and the armor could choose where to spend its limited tungsten like a scalpel rather than a prayer. M18 Hellcats, armed with the same 76mm projectile family as the Shermans, darted to flanks and reverse slopes at speeds that let their gunners set up short, brutal shot windows before fading to new ground, a role amplified by priority access to the scarce HVAP that made mantlet shots reliable at combat ranges. The Shermans, meanwhile, carried fewer of the prized rounds but fit themselves into the net, fixing, baiting, shaping fields of fire, so that when a mantlet or turret face swam into a steady sight picture, the one or two HVAP rounds allotted to a tank could end the argument for that stretch of hedgerow and road. German brigades had come forward configured for shock, but they lacked the reconnaissance screens and infantry escorts to peel away American outposts, and so they advanced with steel exposed to every American strength, artillery on call, air when the weather allowed, and tanks drilled to shoot only when the math favored the shot. In column or in hasty line, Panthers found their thinner sides and turret junctures hunted by gunners who had learned the field by touch, marking ranges off orchard rows and village eaves to fight the slope rather than the thickness, a discipline the new round rewarded but did not replace. When German tanks paused to sort bearings or restack a formation in the open, the delay drew spotting rounds, then salvos, then the shriek of rockets, breaking apart any attempt to reimpose Panther dominance at long range where its gun could rule if left undisturbed. Inside American turrets, the target hierarchy had hardened into habit, mantlet first with HVAP if the range would keep the core intact, turret cheeks if angle allowed, tracks and engine decks when flanking routes opened, and the rest left to high explosive and artillery to blind optics and break formations. Crews counted their tungsten rounds aloud in the lulls, 2, maybe 3, and saved them for the turn in the lane or the crest where the Panther must be thin to fight at all, a rationing that turned scarcity into timing and timing into kills. The difference between waste and victory lived in range estimation and patience, because a shattering core at the wrong distance did more than fail. It signaled the Panther to answer with a gun that could still kill at ranges the Sherman dared not entertain without cover. American command posts treated the battlefield like a living map of overlapping tasks, infantry to clear the blind corners and hold the hedgerow seams, tank destroyers to switch flanks faster than German gunners could traverse, artillery to maul any gathering of silhouettes, and armor to stay disciplined enough to spend tungsten only on the shots that would ripple through a company front. The radios made it possible, fast calls for smoke, quick corrections from observers, and a rhythm of support that let platoon leaders choose aggression with a conscience, knowing that a held lane could summon steel from sky and battery in minutes. Sherman engines idled behind low ridges not because crews were timid, but because the army had learned to treat motion like a fuse, pull it only when the net is ready to burn and the next bend will reveal a turret ring rather than a glacis daring them to try. German crews, many newly minted, found themselves fighting a ghost that was not the fog but the American system itself, which turned every attempt to regain initiative into another geometry problem stacked against them by angles, smoke, and enfilade gun pits. Their doctrine promised safety head-on, but Aracourt kept forcing bad angles in tight spaces, and every time a mantlet failed where it was meant to reassure, the response became more cautious, the advance slower, the reliance on prepared positions greater, the very posture that seated the battlefield's tempo. As Panther commanders hesitated, American observers and tank leaders filled the gap with fires and flanks, converting a moment of doubt into a minute of damage, then into a withdrawal that left wrecks and good ground behind for the Americans to keep. The results were most obvious on the tally sheets. Dozens of German tanks wrecked for far fewer American losses, but the deeper victory was procedural, a learned precision by which a combined arms army turned a few thousand specialized rounds, delivered late and rationed tight, into a force multiplier far larger than their crate count. Priority shipments by air and sea never met the appetites of frontline units, and for months the common allotment remained a handful per Sherman and more for the M18s, a distribution that codified roles without breeding resentment because crews had seen how the pieces fit and how often the net paid them back. If technical history will always praise the tungsten, operational history at Aracourt praises the restraint that made it matter, the willingness to let artillery break nerves and P-47s break columns so that a single HVAP could be spent at the one hinge in the fight that would swing the road and the afternoon. By week's end, the brigades that promised a decisive German riposte could muster only fragments, their Panthers still fearsome machines but no longer the authors of the narrative, because the Americans had demonstrated that a tank is only as invincible as the system around it, and at Aracourt the better system belonged to the side that rationed courage with calculus. What began as a fog fight matured into a doctrine lesson, proving that the surest way to beat a superior gun is to deny it the fight it wants and force it into the one it cannot win, measured in mantlet hits, smoke curtains, artillery timings, and the discipline to hold fire until the geometry agrees. The Panthers would remain lethal wherever they could set their own terms, but the Americans had found the method to keep that circle small and the cost of entering it high, and that method would follow them through Lorraine's fields and into the winter, where scarcity and weather would test it again. In the end, the triumph at Aracourt's tactical level lay less in any single weapon than in the confidence to wait and the preparation to pounce, a habit of mind that turned platoons into springs and battalions into anvils, until even a few tungsten tips, hoarded like gold, could buy whole villages and days of momentum at a discount the enemy could not afford. That is how an army of mediums and Hellcats rode over the myth of the Panther's inevitability, not by outrunning the specifications on paper, but by outthinking the fight in practice, one measured shot and one coordinated minute at a time. The winter came down like a lid over the Ardennes, muffling sound and grounding the sky, and into that hush the Germans pushed their armored spearheads, Panthers and Tigers threading through the snow-choked forest roads toward American lines that were spread thin, surprised, and suddenly very alone beneath a ceiling too low for friendly wings to help them. What the Americans had carried from Lorraine, confidence in combined arms and in a handful of tungsten-tipped chances, met a new arithmetic here, because the HVAP that had felt like a small miracle was scarcer still, the roads were strangled with ice and ambush, and the weather made every promise of air support into a question postponed until the clouds would finally tear. In those first brutal days, some tank companies burned through their precious HVAP within hours, firing only when a mantlet filled the sight and still finding that the fog and range and angle made even discipline feel like a gamble, leaving them to fight on with standard rounds, movement, and the old lessons of flanking and patience against an enemy that was prepared to force the fight frontally whenever ground allowed it. Tungsten had always been a strategic coin spent sparingly, and the winter made it rarer still, because national reserves had never been large and priority for the best subcaliber ammunition still bent toward the tank destroyer units whose very doctrine demanded first crack at enemy armor, leaving many Shermans with only a few HVAP rounds in their racks, and some with none at all. Crews counted what they had in low voices, 2, maybe 5, and swore to spend them only where geometry and distance would keep the brittle cores intact, a discipline made harder by the knowledge that the Panthers now pushing at the seams of the line had trained to make the first shot count and to keep their fronts angled toward any threat that dared hold a lane. The snow did not stop the guns, it only changed their questions, and American platoons relearned what the hedgerows had already taught, that survival and victory begin by shaping the fight, so they turned again to infantry with rocket launchers working close in the trees, to artillery that could blind and break formations with time-on-target salvos, and to the tactical patience that let a single well-placed penetration ripple outward through a column already slowed by ice and uncertainty. In town after nameless crossroad, Shermans traded space for position, using smoke and dead ground to force the Panthers to pivot and show cheeks and tracks, then calling guns down on the places where German armor massed to push again, because in that weather the sky was a reluctant ally and the batteries were the fastest answer to the thunder inside the trees. The radio became the most precious tool in the turret, binding tank, infantry, and artillery in a tight conversation that could make a narrow street survivable, hold, fix, call the grid, and when the shells had done their tearing work, spend the tungsten once to end the argument with a shot through the space where a gun must move and armor must thin. The experience of Lorraine still mattered, mantlet first if the range is right, cheeks if angle allows, flanks by maneuver when a side road offers a bite, and yet the Ardennes added a harsher note to that catechism. Sometimes the only fight available is a frontal one, and in that case courage becomes timing, and timing becomes whether the round that matters is still in the rack when the moment arrives. More than one crew learn in the worst way that HVAP is not a spell but a tool with edges and limits. At the longest winter distances its core could chip or shatter on impact, and on the steepest slopes it could ricochet at speeds that made the failure feel cruelly loud, reminders that even miracles weigh only so much against physics and steel. So the best crews husbanded their rare rounds and used everything else, smoke, defilade, the clutter of wrecks and farm walls, to squeeze range and angle until the tungsten could do what it had been asked to do, which was to make a very small hole in a very exact place and let chemistry and stowed charges make the hole larger and final. The German attack was a hammer in many places and a ghost in others, and when Panthers appeared where maps had promised only patrols, American units that had been scattered for rest or movement found themselves improvising roadblocks and interlocking fields of fire in minutes, buying time with engine noise and bursts of heat until artillery could find the rhythm and tank destroyers could fall into their hunting lanes. Sometimes that bought time was all that mattered, because the winter slowed everyone and made every mile feel longer, and a platoon that held a bend in the road for an hour might save a battalion supply for a day, the kind of arithmetic that turns individual gunnery into operational endurance. Shortages were not just tungsten but everything that delivers tungsten, trucks stuck in drifts, fuel rationed to whoever could move at all, and depots struggling to push the right caliber to the right guns while the front lines shifted under pressure, a logistical fog that made even the best resupply officers into gamblers by necessity. And yet the weather itself had an ending, and when the skies finally thinned in late December and early January, the sound above the treelines changed the grammar of battle. P-47s and their kin came down like clauses of iron and flame, trapping German armor on the roads that the snow had already narrowed, and the columns that had menaced crossroads became strings of burning punctuation across the white. Wherever the sky returned, American artillery and armor moved with a surer step, because suddenly the time between spotting and striking compressed again, and the Panthers that had ruled open fields when they could claim long lines of fire found that every halt to sort bearings might also be an invitation to rockets and strafing runs. The offensive that had opened with surprise and speed began to slow under the cumulative drag of destroyed bridges, ambushed choke points, and 1,000 small decisions by crews who chose to stand, call, and then hit once with the round that mattered, a pattern that traded tungsten and teamwork for time until the German momentum bled out. Even as the fight turned, the lessons remained stark. Innovation could bend the balance but not erase the fundamentals, and so commanders kept HVAP priority with the tank destroyers whose missions demanded it, while Sherman units learned to plan around scarcity, set the trap, fix the target, save the tungsten for the hinge, because to do otherwise was to have nothing left when the decisive silhouette finally stepped into the sights. Some companies never saw a resupply of the special rounds before the winter's worst was over, and many Shermans went into the hardest fights with only a token few, a reality that bred neither despair nor waste but a colder sort of confidence, the knowledge that even a rationed miracle, placed well, is enough. For every crew that wished for more, there was an officer counting what existed on a clipboard and choosing the sectors where those rounds would end the most arguments, a grim arithmetic that any army at war must learn and that the Americans, by this stage, had grown unflinchingly good at practicing. By January, the shattered hulks of German armor across the snow told the story that statistics would later underline. The offensive had failed, and the price had been paid in irreplaceable machines and exhausted crews who could not be rebuilt as quickly as losses demanded, especially under skies now hostile again. American forces, bruised and wiser, carried forward a reinforced conviction that had begun in Lorraine, that the surest answers in armored war are not a single caliber or a single vehicle, but a system that brings the right fire at the right moment, and a discipline that spends rare tools only where they can change everything. The bitter winter had tested the limits of innovation and found them real, but it had also proved that innovation married to method could make scarcity stretch and courage count, until the road ahead belonged once more to those who could hold it longest and hit hardest when the fog, finally, lifts. By the spring of 1945, the battlefield verdict on tungsten-core hope had been rendered. HVAP did not make the Sherman a Panther, but it made American armored doctrine sharper, faster, and more certain about where to spend courage and steel, an evolution whose lessons would echo from ruined Lorraine villages to the drawing boards of the Cold War and beyond. Post-war examiners walked the fields and workshops with clipboards and calipers, tracing neat entry holes through mantlets and turret faces, confirming that under the right angles and distances, the tungsten-core had done exactly what the doctrine demanded, while also noting how steep slope and long range could still turn a miracle into a ricochet or a shatter, a reality check that kept tactics honest even in victory. Their conclusion was blunt and paradoxical. HVAP mattered precisely because it did not pretend to solve everything. It forced armies to think in systems, to choreograph artillery and air, movement and deception, so that a few rare shots could be the hinge on which whole actions turned. The commanders who fought at Aracourt carried this synthesis forward, none more visibly than Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams of the 37th Tank Battalion, whose war-forged convictions about training, tempo, and ammunition discipline rose with him to the Army's top job and into the design philosophy of the tank that would bear his name. To those officers, the lesson was not build a better tank alone but build a better system, then arm it with ammunition that makes its timing lethal, a creed that would surface decades later in the M1 Abrams with a high-energy gun mated to advanced penetrators designed to end fights quickly from the angles the crew could create and hold. The conceptual lineage ran straight through materials science, where 1944 had relied on tungsten carbide cores in lightweight carriers. The 1970s and 1980s would commit to long-rod penetrators of tungsten alloy or depleted uranium, discarding sabots to hurl density and speed along a narrow path of decision, evolution, not rupture, in the art of concentrated kinetic energy. Across the new frontier in the West German Bundeswehr, veterans who had once guided Panthers through catastrophe helped shape an armor doctrine sober about quality, logistics, and the hard limits of machine superiority without a matching system behind it. Their planners absorbed the wartime proof that ammunition effectiveness and crew training could offset tonnage and thickness, insights that breathed into Leopard 1 and then Leopard 2, tanks that prized optics, fire control, and penetrator performance as much as armor plate, trusting agility, range, and first-shot probability to keep crews alive. Where the Panther had tried to embody invulnerability in steel, the Cold War designs distilled survivability as a function of seeing first, hitting first, and making the hit count, an operational grammar written, in part, by the memory of mantlets pierced where the designers had been forced to be thin. American analysts framed VAP's legacy as both technological and psychological. It not only gave medium tanks a credible way to hurt what they feared, it taught crews that doctrine and discipline could manufacture opportunity against machines that seemed to own the specifications on paper. This mental shift, believing a fight can be shaped and then finishing it with a scarce, decisive shot, left fingerprints all over later training, from target hierarchies to range estimation drills, all the way to the rules of when to spend the best rounds in an ammunition rack that would never be bottomless. Even artillery and air learned from the tanker's economy, refining time on target and strike sequencing to open precisely the seams that a single penetrator could widen into collapse, a choreography whose roots ran back to the fog and hedgerows where scarcity had been the sternest teacher. Production tables, as ever, told their own story. Roughly 49,324 Shermans built against about 6,132 Panthers was an 8-to-1 industrial reality that no amount of German technical finesse could reverse once the Americans had found ammunition and methods to narrow the lethality gap at the decisive moments of contact. HVAP did not erase the glassy problem or change the geometry of sloped armor, but it reduced the number of tactical situations in which the Panthers' advantages translated into wins, especially when the Americans could force turret shots, cheeks, and mantlet hits at ranges where the core would stay intact. That arithmetic, many good machines using a few rare rounds at the right time, proved more decisive than fewer great machines fighting on terms that the enemy refused to grant them twice. If Europe was VAP's trial, Korea became its vindication, where plentiful stocks and familiar 76mm guns on improved Sherman variants met T-3485s whose armor could not bear tungsten-core velocities at typical engagement ranges. American crews, now unhampered by extreme tungsten scarcity, recorded favorable exchange ratios that sprang from both better training and the cold fact that the ammunition did what physics promised when angles and distances cooperated, a sobering coda for veterans who had wanted those crates 2 summers earlier in Normandy and Lorraine. Korea did not prove the Sherman invincible any more than Lorraine had proved the Panther invincible. It proved, again, that ammunition and crew skill together decide what enough looks like in the field, and that supply chains can be as lethal or forgiving as any gun. The post-war technical autopsy of HVAP noted the brittleness of tungsten carbide at lower impact velocities and against severe slopes, codifying range discipline into manuals and ensuring that "know your distance" lived in every gunnery syllabus that followed. Engineers also drew a straight line from the subcaliber core concept to discarding sabot architectures. If mass, density, and speed are the central levers, then design should devote as much of a projectile's budget to the penetrator as possible and shed the rest the instant it has done its guiding work. What began as an emergency answer to the Panther's face hardened into a general principle for tank guns in the missile age: focus, accelerate, simplify, and let materials do what geometry demands, backed by fire control that makes geometry predictable. German officers interviewed after the war spoke with a professional's respect and a realist's regret. They had understood the value of tungsten cores early, but not even the best idea can survive a starving supply chain and factories under bombardment, so frontline tanks fought with standard rounds while machine tools hoarded the rare metal needed to keep the rest of the war turning. In that sense, VAP's deepest lesson was industrial, not tactical. An alliance's access to materials and manufacturing tempo can change the meaning of a weapon already in hand, turning a middling specification into a winning tool when its best ammunition finally arrives in useful quantity. Strategy lives or dies at that altitude, where ships and rail, mines and contracts, decide what any crew may expect to find in the last rack when the next turn in the road shows steel. By the time the Abrams and Leopard families matured, their designers had absorbed every wartime contradiction. Armor protects until it invites overconfidence, firepower dominates until the enemy rewrites the approach, numbers win until they are misused, and ammunition is a limited currency best spent when the system has made the outcome almost unfair. Modern depleted uranium or tungsten long rods, rifled from sabots at extreme velocities, are VAP's grandchildren, denser, longer, guided by better sights, but still obeying the same physics and the same doctrine of restraint that Aracourt stamped into an army's habits under a cold sky. What crews remember, then and now, fits in a few sentences: see first, shape first, hit once where the enemy must be thin to fight at all, and save the rarest round for the moment when that truth is in your sights, because history suggests you will not need a second. If the Sherman became the backbone rather than the hero, and the Panther the icon rather than the victor, it is because the wars last year proved that systems beat specifications whenever ammunition and training let courage choose its moment wisely. And so the quiet legacy of HVAP is not a boast but a habit, an army that rationed belief like tungsten, saved it for the hinge, and then spent it without flinching when the mantlet finally filled the sight. In the final months of the war, when wrecks rusted into hedgerows and the roads to the Rhine filled with the ash-gray dust of retreating armies, a quiet understanding settled over those who had lived inside turrets. The winning side had not simply fielded a better tank, it had built a better system, and fed it not just fuel and shells but an idea: use everything, wait for the moment, and spend the rarest shot where it will break more than steel. HVAP embodied that idea without ever pretending to be a miracle, a tungsten-core promise that worked only when married to patience and geometry, to artillery and air, to the infantry who slipped ahead and the observers who stitched time on target over crossroads that mattered. In that sense, its legacy was as much moral as material, a discipline that turned scarcity into timing and timing into wins. The men who brought that discipline home translated it into doctrine and design, insisting that the next generation of armor must amplify the habit that had saved them: see first, shape first, and strike once where the enemy must be thin to fight at all. Creighton Abrams's path from the 37th Tank Battalion at Aracourt to the office of Army Chief of Staff gave the lesson a steward with battlefield scars, and his name on America's main battle tank symbolized more than honor. It marked a through line from the fog of Lorraine to a platform built to turn sight, shot, and survivability into one coherent instrument. The tank that bore his name entered service with a 105mm gun before adopting the 120mm smoothbore and pairing it with advanced penetrators and fire control, a marriage of velocity, density, and computation that carried the HVAP principle forward into the age of long-rod sabos and split-second ballistic solutions. Even the details, blow-off panels, separated stowage, stabilized sights, whispered lessons learned the hard way by crews who had seen what happened when a penetrator found ready ammunition and when one extra second of turret steadiness turned a chance into a kill. Across the Atlantic, German veterans entered a new army with clearer eyes, having learned that brilliant machines cannot redeem empty fuel tanks, broken rail lines, or the absence of the right ammunition at the right hour. Their planners emphasized optics, fire control, and lethality per round as fiercely as armor thickness, steering toward leopard designs that bet survivability on first-shot probability and penetrators that made arguments brief rather than armor that promised invulnerability, a promise Aracourt had already disproved. The shared NATO vocabulary that emerged, mobility, sensors, long-rod tungsten or depleted uranium cores, and training that prizes tempo and restraint, was less a revolution than the codification of wartime pragmatism under harsher skies. Post-war analysts, measuring neat holes in mantlets and plucking brittle fragments from glassy scars, wrote the technical coda: tungsten carbide hits hard but can shatter low and ricochet steep, so range and angle must be treated as commandments, not suggestions, and ammunition discipline must be written into every syllabus as surely as gunnery tables. They drew a straight line from subcaliber cores to discarding sabos, from high velocity to longer rods, from makeshift foresight to digital fire control, each step another way of concentrating energy into a narrow, predictable path through the one place armor must give room to mechanics and men. The language of modern guns, M829 series, tungsten alloys, APFSDS, speaks a dialect first formed in 1944 workshops and proven in the hedgerows, not as myth but as method. Industrial Arithmetic wrote the larger verdict: roughly 49,324 Shermans against about 6,132 Panthers is not a debate, it is destiny when matched to logistics that deliver fuel, parts, and enough specialized ammunition to bend odds at the hinge of a fight. HVAP did not make every Sherman equal to every Panther, but it cut down the number of situations in which the German machine's paper superiority became a battlefield certainty, especially when Americans forced turret shots, cheeks, and mantlets at ranges where the core kept its integrity. In war, that kind of narrowing, fewer losing positions, more winnable moments, is how armies change outcomes with tools their enemies dismissed as inadequate just months earlier. Korea would underline the point in sterner ink, as plentiful HVAP supplies paired with seasoned crews and improved Sherman variants faced T-3485s whose armor could not bear tungsten velocities across the typical distances of hill and valley fights. Veterans of Europe recognized the old geometry playing out on new terrain, angles and aim still ruled, but now the ammunition pipeline matched the need, and the results looked like vindication delivered 5 years late. No tank became invulnerable in Asia any more than in Europe. Ammunition turned competence into superiority, and logistics turned superiority into sustained advantage. For the crews who lived it, the war's last lesson was personal: confidence is a weapon that loads just as surely as any shell, and the knowledge that a single, rare round can end a duel becomes a habit of steadiness, the willingness to hold the lane, to let artillery and air cut the problem down to size, and then to press the trigger once without flinching. For the designers who followed, the lesson was merciless: do not ask men to improvise what industry can deliver, build the fire control that makes range a constant, the stowage that forgives a bad minute, and the ammunition that makes a right moment decisive rather than merely promising. For the logisticians who knit an ocean to a front line, the lesson was the oldest: victory is a chain, and the rarest links, tungsten, fuel, engines, trained hands, must arrive together, on time, or not at all. So the story of a few ounces of carbide hidden in aluminum carriers ends up larger than physics, because it marked the place where an army chose method over myth and discipline over bravado, and proved that a medium tank with enough friends, and the right shot saved for the right second, could unmake an icon. The monuments and museums carry the famous silhouettes now, the rounded hull and the long-nosed gun, but the quiet artifacts are the diagrams and dog-eared range cards, the after-action notes about angles and fog and timing, and the clipped lists that said, "Hold fire, call grid, spend tungsten once." In that clipped language lives the enduring lesson: technology wins nothing alone, willpower misapplied bleeds away, and industrial might without judgment only makes ruins faster, yet together, guided by restraint and clarity, they can bend even a brutal century toward an honest victory. If there is a last image to keep, it is not the moment of penetration but the moment before it, the breath held, the range set, the lane owned by a platoon that has done its homework and counted its rare rounds, because history suggests that when the mantlet fills the sight under those conditions, you do not need a second shot.